The fluorescent lights of Denver International Airport hummed their relentless tune, casting a sickly pallor over the polished marble floors that stretched endlessly in all directions. Sarah Chen stood at gate 23, her worn leather messenger bag clutched against her chest like armor, watching the departure board flicker with mechanical precision. Flight 447 to Phoenix. Delayed 30 minutes. Again. She pressed her fingers against her temples, feeling the familiar throb that had become her constant companion these past 8 months. The headaches came in waves now, each one bringing with it the phantom sound of aircraft engines and the metallic taste of grief that never quite left her mouth. Dr. Martinez had called it PTSD, but Sarah knew it was something simpler and more devastating. It was the weight of unanswered questions. The coffee in her paper cup had gone cold hours ago, but she held on to it anyway, needing something solid and real to anchor her trembling hands. The cup bore the logo of a chain restaurant where she'd worked the breakfast shift that morning. Her third job in a rotation that barely kept the creditors at bay. Her uniform polo shirt peeked out from beneath her blazer, the fabric cheap and rough against her skin, a constant reminder of how far she'd fallen from her days in the control tower. Around her, the airport buzzed with the controlled chaos of modern travel. Business travelers in crisp suits spoke into wireless headsets, their voices carrying the confident cadence of people whose biggest worry was missing a meeting. Families with young children dragged oversized suitcases, the parents' faces etched with the particular exhaustion that comes from navigating airports with toddlers. And scattered throughout, like herself, were the solo travelers. The ones with stories written in the lines around their eyes, and the careful way they counted bills before buying overpriced sandwiches. The air carried a cocktail of scents that had become as familiar to Sarah as her own breathing. The industrial sweetness of cleaning chemicals mixing with coffee, fast food, and the underlying petroleum tang that seemed to permeate every corner of every airport in America. But beneath it all, Sarah could smell something else, something that made her stomach clench with recognition. Fear. It hung in the recycled air like humidity before a storm. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, feeling the worn sole of her left shoe where the heel had begun to separate. These were her good shoes, the ones she'd bought 3 years ago when David was still alive and they could afford things like matching luggage sets and anniversary dinners at restaurants with white tablecloths. Now she carefully rotated between this pair and the sneakers she wore to her evening job cleaning office buildings, making each last as long as possible. Her phone buzzed against her hip, and she glanced at the screen. Another text from her sister Lisa, the 4th one today. "Sarah, please call me. This obsession isn't healthy. Come stay with us in Portland, please." Sarah deleted the message without responding, just as she had the others. Lisa meant well, but she lived in a world where problems could be solved with therapy sessions and positive thinking, where the idea that a major airline might actually murder people for profit was too fantastic to consider. Lisa had a husband who came home every night, children who fought over who got the bigger slice of birthday cake, a mortgage on a house where the biggest drama was whether to paint the kitchen yellow or green. Sarah's world had contracted to 3 essential elements: work, legal documents, and the growing certainty that her husband had been murdered. She pulled out her phone again and scrolled through the photos until she found the one she always returned to. David, standing in front of their old house, wearing his pilot's uniform and grinning like he'd just won the lottery. His hair was slightly mussed from removing his cap, and there was a coffee stain on his tie that he hadn't noticed. It had been taken the morning of his last flight, just 6 hours before Meridian Flight 1247 had experienced catastrophic engine failure over the Colorado Rockies. The official report had been as clean and sterile as the corporate offices where it was written. Mechanical failure, routine maintenance oversight, no negligence detected, case closed. The settlement offer had arrived within 2 weeks, accompanied by a letter expressing the airline's deepest sympathies and their hope that this generous compensation would help her move forward. But Sarah had spent 12 years in air traffic control before her breakdown, and she knew the difference between a mechanical failure and something else entirely. She'd seen the preliminary flight data before the lawyers made it disappear. She'd noticed the pattern in the timing. And most importantly, she'd found David's notebook, hidden in his flight bag, filled with calculations and observations that painted a very different picture of what had happened to Flight 1247. A voice crackled over the intercom, cutting through her memories. Ladies and gentlemen, Meridian Airlines Flight 447 to Phoenix is now ready for boarding. We'd like to begin with our first-class passengers and those needing special assistance. Sarah looked up at the gate where a small crowd had begun to gather. The boarding process always fascinated her in its careful choreography of class and privilege. First came the wealthy, the frequent flyers with their platinum cards and priority status, sweeping past the rope barriers like they owned the aircraft. Then came families with small children, struggling with car seats and diaper bags, followed by the military personnel in their crisp uniforms. She would board with Group 4, squeezed into a middle seat in the back of the plane, surrounded by the other economy passengers who'd learned to pack light and expect little. The ticket had cost her 3 weeks' worth of grocery money, but she'd had no choice. The lawyer in Phoenix claimed he had new evidence, something that could break open the case against Meridian Airlines, something that could finally give her answers about why David had to die. As she watched the boarding process unfold, Sarah noticed something odd. The gate agent, a young woman with dark hair pulled back in a tight bun, kept glancing nervously at her clipboard. Her hands shook slightly as she scanned boarding passes, and twice she'd paused to wipe sweat from her forehead despite the air conditioning. Most telling of all, she kept looking toward the jetway entrance with an expression that Sarah recognized from her own mirror. The look of someone who knew something terrible was about to happen. The woman's name tag read Jessica Torres, and she couldn't be more than 25, too young to have the kind of deep worry lines that were starting to form around her eyes, too young to be checking her phone every 30 seconds like she was expecting news that would change everything. "Group 2! We're now boarding Group 2, Jessica announced, her voice carrying just the slightest tremor that most passengers would miss. But Sarah had spent years listening for the subtle signs of stress in pilots' voices, the microscopic changes in tone that could indicate everything from fatigue to mechanical problems to something much worse. As Group 2 passengers began moving toward the gate, Sarah noticed something else. Several of the boarding passengers looked familiar, though she couldn't immediately place from where. A distinguished man in his 50s with silver hair and an expensive suit. 2 younger men who moved with the careful posture of people accustomed to following orders. A woman in her 40s clutching a briefcase like it contained state secrets. Then it hit her. She'd seen their faces in the legal documents scattered across her kitchen table, in the depositions and witness lists that had consumed her life for the past 8 months. These weren't ordinary passengers heading to Phoenix for business meetings or family visits. These were the people connected to Flight 1247, the people who knew what really happened to her husband. Group 3, we're now ready to board Group 3. Sarah's heart began to race as the pieces clicked into place. This wasn't a coincidence. Somehow, some way, the key players in David's death were all boarding the same flight. The flight she was supposed to be on. The flight that Jessica Torres was clearly terrified to see depart. She pulled out her phone and quickly searched for Flight 447's details. According to the airline's website, it was a routine commercial flight, scheduled to arrive in Phoenix at 3:47 p.m. But as Sarah dug deeper, cross-referencing the flight number with the databases she still had access to from her air traffic control days, she found discrepancies. The aircraft registration didn't match. The flight plan showed a different route than what was publicly listed. And most disturbing of all, the manifest showed only 12 passengers on a plane that could hold 150. Group 4, we're now boarding Group 4. All remaining passengers, please have your boarding passes ready. Sarah stood up, her legs unsteady beneath her. Every instinct she'd developed over years of ensuring flight safety was screaming at her to turn around, to walk away, to catch the next flight or take the bus, or simply go home to her empty apartment and pretend none of this was happening. But as she approached the gate, Jessica Torres looked directly at her, and Sarah saw something in the young woman's eyes that changed everything. It wasn't just fear, it was recognition. Jessica knew who she was. More than that, Jessica had been waiting for her. "Ma'am," Jessica whispered as Sarah approached the podium, her voice so low that only Sarah could hear. "Ma'am, please, don't board this flight." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Around them, the normal bustle of airport activity continued. Passengers dragged their carry-on bags toward the jetway. Children whined about wanting snacks. Business travelers typed frantically on their phones. But in the small space between Sarah and Jessica, time seemed to stop. "What did you say?" Sarah asked, though she'd heard perfectly. Jessica's eyes darted around nervously before settling back on Sarah's face. "Please," she whispered again, "find another flight, any other flight, just please don't get on this plane." The rational part of Sarah's mind knew she should listen, should turn around, walk away, and find another way to get to Phoenix. But the part of her that had been searching for answers for 8 months, the part that had sacrificed everything for the chance to finally learn the truth about David's death, wouldn't let her move. She looked into Jessica's frightened eyes and made a choice that would change everything. "I'm getting on this plane," she said quietly. "But first, I need to know why you don't want me to." Jessica glanced around again, then leaned closer. "Because," she whispered, "my father is Miguel Torres. He was one of the mechanics who worked on Flight 1247, and tomorrow morning he's supposed to testify about what really happened to your husband." The world seemed to tilt beneath Sarah's feet. She gripped the edge of the podium to steady herself, her mind racing through the implications of Jessica's words. Miguel Torres. She remembered that name from the legal documents, remembered him as one of the few Meridian employees who'd refused to sign the company's standard non-disclosure agreement after David's crash. "Your father," Sarah began, but Jessica cut her off with a sharp shake of her head. "Not here," Jessica whispered urgently. "Too many people listening. Just please, Mrs. Chen, get off this plane before it's too late." But Sarah was already moving toward the jetway, her boarding pass clutched in her hand. After 8 months of dead ends and legal obstacles and sleepless nights, she was finally close to answers. She wasn't turning back now, no matter how scared a young gate agent might be. She didn't see Jessica pull out her phone as she walked away, didn't see the tears running down the young woman's face as she typed a text message to her father. "She's on the plane. I tried to stop her, but she wouldn't listen. God forgive me, Papa. She's on the plane." And Sarah certainly didn't see the man in the expensive suit who'd been watching their entire exchange from behind a pillar 20 feet away, his own phone pressed to his ear as he spoke in low, urgent tones to someone on the other end. "Yes, sir," Marcus Whitfield said into the phone, his voice tight with controlled panic. "She's boarding. The Chen woman is actually boarding the flight." He paused, listening to the voice on the other end. "No, sir, I don't think she knows what she's walking into. But after tomorrow, it won't matter what she knows." As Sarah disappeared into the jetway, the wheels of a conspiracy 8 months in the making began, their final terrible rotation. The jetway stretched before Sarah like a tunnel leading into the unknown, its corrugated walls humming with the vibration of the aircraft's auxiliary power unit. Each step forward felt weighted with the gravity of decisions made and unmade. But as her worn shoes touched the threshold of Flight 447, her mind drifted backward to a different kind of threshold, one crossed 30 years ago by 2 people who would shape everything she believed about courage, sacrifice, and the price of doing what was right. Her parents had arrived at San Francisco International Airport on a humid August morning in 1994. clutching nothing but a canvas bag containing their entire worldly possessions and a folded piece of paper with an address scrawled in her mother's careful handwriting. Chen had been 32 then, his hands already calloused from years of working in aircraft maintenance back in Taiwan, while her mother, Lin, carried 2-year-old Sarah against her chest in a sling made from an old bedsheet. Sarah could still remember fragments of that day, though she'd been too young to understand the magnitude of what was happening. The smell of her mother's fear sweat mixed with the industrial disinfectant of the airport bathrooms, where they'd spent their first night in America, too proud to admit they had nowhere else to go. The way her father's voice had cracked when he'd tried to ask for directions in his broken English, only to be met with impatient sighs and turned backs from busy travelers who couldn't be bothered with an immigrant family's confusion. But what Sarah remembered most clearly was the moment her father had knelt down in that airport bathroom, unzipped their canvas bag, and pulled out a small wooden box that had somehow survived the journey from their old life to this new one. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper that had yellowed with age, was a tiny jade bracelet that had belonged to her grandmother, the only thing of value they'd managed to bring with them. "This," her father had whispered in Mandarin, holding the bracelet up to catch the harsh fluorescent light. "This is not just jewelry, Xiaobao. This is a promise that we will build something here that was worth leaving everything behind for." Lin had taken the bracelet with trembling fingers, not to wear it, but to wrap it carefully back in its tissue paper and place it at the bottom of their bag. It would stay there for the next 15 years, through cramped studio apartments and double shifts at jobs that paid barely enough to survive, through nights when they ate rice and canned vegetables for dinner so Sarah could have milk with her cereal in the morning, through the slow, grinding process of building a life from nothing in a country that seemed designed to break people who arrived with empty pockets and full hearts. Wei had found work at a small aircraft maintenance facility in Oakland, starting as the lowest man on a crew that barely acknowledged his existence. His degree in aeronautical engineering from National Taiwan University meant nothing here. He was just another immigrant willing to work for wages that American workers wouldn't accept. But every evening, after coming home with his clothes stained with hydraulic fluid and his back aching from crawling through cargo holds, he would sit at their tiny kitchen table with Sarah on his lap and teach her about airplanes. "You see, Xiaobao," he would say, pointing to diagrams he'd drawn on the backs of envelope scraps, "an airplane is like a family. Every part must work together, must trust every other part, or everyone falls from the sky. The pilot trusts the mechanic trusts the engineer trusts the inspector. Break that trust, and people die." Those lessons had shaped Sarah more than any formal education ever could. While other children learned about fairness from fairy tales, Sarah learned about responsibility from her father's calloused hands, showing her how to properly torque a bolt, how to read stress fractures in metal, how a single overlooked detail could mean the difference between a safe landing and a smoking crater. Lin worked nights cleaning office buildings in downtown San Francisco, taking buses that ran sporadically, and arriving home just as Wei was leaving for his morning shift. For 3 years, Sarah barely saw both parents at the same time except on Sundays, when they would sit together in their cramped living room and count the money they'd saved that week. Nickels and dimes and crumpled dollar bills that slowly accumulated in a coffee can hidden behind the refrigerator. The coffee can was their shrine to the American dream, and Sarah learned to treat it with the reverence that other families reserved for religious artifacts. Every Friday night, after Lin had counted the week's earnings and subtracted the absolute minimum needed for rent, food, and utilities, any remaining money would go into the can with a small ceremony that never varied. "This is not just money," Lin would tell her daughter, holding up each bill before folding it carefully and adding it to the growing pile. "This is Sarah's college fund. This is our house fund. This is proof that we made the right choice to come here." But what Sarah didn't understand until much later was that the coffee can represented something more complex than simple saving. It was her parents' way of maintaining hope in the face of a system that seemed designed to keep them exactly where they were. Wei's supervisors at the maintenance facility consistently passed him over for promotions, claiming he lacked the communication skills necessary for leadership positions, even as they relied on his expertise to solve problems that stumped more senior technicians. Lynn's cleaning company paid her less than minimum wage, justifying the illegal practice by threatening to report her immigration status if she complained. The breaking point came during Sarah's senior year of high school, when the coffee can finally held enough money for a down payment on a small house in a neighborhood where the schools were good enough to give her a real shot at college. But the same week they'd planned to start house hunting, Wei was injured at work when a hydraulic lift malfunctioned and crushed his left leg. The company's insurance claimed the accident was due to operator error, despite the fact that Wei had been using the same equipment without incident for 8 years. The medical bills consumed their savings within 2 months, and the temporary disability payments barely covered their rent. Worse, Wei's injury left him with a permanent limp that made it impossible for him to do the physical aspects of aircraft maintenance that had defined his career. Sarah watched her father shrink during those months of forced inactivity, saw the way he stared at his hands as if they belonged to someone else, but she also saw something that would influence every decision she made for the rest of her life. She saw him refuse to give up. Instead of wallowing in self-pity, Wei used his forced retirement to study for the Federal Aviation Administration exams that would allow him to transition from hands-on maintenance to safety inspection. He spent his days at the public library, checking out textbooks on aviation law and regulatory compliance, teaching himself the bureaucratic language that would give him authority over the same supervisors who had dismissed him for his accent. "You see, Sarah," he told her one evening as she helped him study for his inspector certification, "sometimes the system breaks you so that you can learn to fix the system. I could not change things as a mechanic with dirty hands, but as an inspector with a clipboard, I can make sure other mechanics are not treated like I was treated." The jade bracelet came out of storage the day Wei passed his FAA inspector exam. Lynn held it up to the light just as he had done in that airport bathroom years earlier, but this time her hands were steady and her voice was strong. "Now," she said, "now we have truly arrived." Wei's new job as an FAA safety inspector paid 3 times what he'd made as a mechanic, and it came with something even more valuable: respect. Suddenly, the same supervisors who had ignored his suggestions for years were hanging on his every word, knowing that his reports could shut down entire operations if he found serious violations. More importantly, Wei discovered that his years of hands-on experience gave him insights that inspectors who had learned everything from textbooks simply couldn't match. He could spot signs of stress fatigue that others missed, could identify shortcuts and safety violations that had become so routine that they were practically invisible to management. Within 6 months, he had a reputation as one of the most thorough and fair inspectors in the region, tough enough to demand compliance with safety standards, but practical enough to work with companies to fix problems rather than simply punish them. Sarah had been accepted to the University of California, Davis by then, planning to study aeronautical engineering just like her father had done decades earlier in Taiwan. But watching Wei's transformation from dismissed immigrant to respected authority figure had sparked a different kind of ambition. She wanted to understand not just how aircraft worked, but how the entire system of aviation safety functioned, who made the decisions, who enforced the rules, and most importantly, what happened when the people in charge cared more about profits than about the lives of the passengers who trusted them to do their jobs correctly. She changed her major to air traffic control, a decision that baffled many of her classmates who saw it as a step down from engineering. But Sarah understood something they didn't, that the real power in aviation safety lay not in designing aircraft, but in controlling how they moved through the sky, in being the human link between technology and safety that could never be automated away. The jade bracelet passed to Sarah on her college graduation day, along with a letter from her parents that she had read so many times over the years that she could recite it from memory. Our dearest daughter, today you become the first person in our family to graduate from an American university. This achievement belongs not just to you, but to every Chen who came before you and to every Chen who will come after. The bracelet you now wear carried your great-grandmother through war, carried us through our journey to this country, and now it will carry you through whatever challenges await. Remember always that our strength comes not from avoiding hardship, but from facing it together, from never forgetting that individual success means nothing if it is not used to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Sarah had worn the bracelet every day since then. Through her training at the FAA Academy, through her first assignment at a small regional airport in Nevada, through her transfer to Denver International, where she'd met David Thompson, a young pilot who shared her obsession with safety protocols and her belief that every person who boarded an aircraft deserved to reach their destination alive. David had understood immediately why she carried her father's lessons about trust and responsibility so close to her heart. His own background was different. He'd grown up in suburban Denver, the son of a middle school teacher and an insurance adjuster, with advantages that Sarah's family could never have imagined. But he'd chosen aviation for the same reason she had, because he believed that flying was humanity at its best, a daily demonstration that people could work together to achieve something impossible, to carry millions of passengers safely through the sky, simply because they trusted each other to do their jobs correctly. They'd married in a small ceremony at the Denver Botanic Gardens, with Wei officiating as an ordained minister. A credential he'd earned online, specifically so he could perform the ceremony. Sarah had worn her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her smaller frame, and the jade bracelet had caught the afternoon sunlight as she'd promised to love David Thompson through whatever challenges they might face together. For 8 years, it had seemed like those challenges would be manageable. David advanced from regional airlines to Meridian's mainline operation, while Sarah earned promotions that eventually made her one of the youngest senior controllers at DIA. They'd bought a house in Aurora with a view of the mountains, had started talking seriously about children, had begun to believe that the American dream her parents had chased so desperately was actually within their reach. But now, as Sarah settled into seat 23F aboard Flight 447, feeling the jade bracelet's familiar weight against her wrist, she understood that all of those dreams had been built on foundations that could be destroyed by people who valued quarterly profits more than human lives. The same trust that her father had taught her to see as aviation's greatest strength had become its greatest vulnerability when the people in positions of authority decided that safety was negotiable. The aircraft door closed with a solid thunk that seemed to echo through her bones, and Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cabin's air conditioning. Around her, the other passengers settled into their seats with the casual confidence of people who had never had reason to doubt that their flight would end safely. They checked their phones one last time, adjusted their seatbelts, and prepared to entrust their lives to a system that Sarah was beginning to understand might be fundamentally broken. She closed her eyes and pressed her fingers against the jade bracelet, feeling the smooth stone that had traveled so far and seen so much. Her parents had taught her that strength came from facing hardship together, but as Flight 447 began to taxi toward the runway, Sarah had never felt more alone. What she didn't know was that in the cockpit, Captain Robert Hayes was staring at a flight plan that didn't match any of the standard routes to Phoenix, while in the cabin, 3 federal aviation inspectors were reviewing files that contained information explosive enough to bring down one of the largest airlines in America. And in the corporate headquarters of Meridian Airlines, Marcus Whitfield was placing a phone call that would set in motion the final act of a conspiracy that had already cost David Thompson his life. Sarah opened her eyes as the aircraft turned onto the runway, and for just a moment she thought she could hear her father's voice carried on the recycled air. "Break that trust, Xiaobao, and people die." The engines spooled up to takeoff power, and Flight 447 began its roll into the gathering darkness. Comment below, what detail from Sarah's family history caught your attention the most? Was it her father's transformation from mechanic to inspector, or something else that made you feel indignant about how immigrants are often treated in pursuit of the American dream? The aircraft lifted off into the Colorado twilight with the mechanical precision that had made commercial aviation the safest, a form of travel in human history. But as Flight 447 climbed through 10,000 feet, Sarah Chen found herself studying her fellow passengers with the trained eye of someone who had spent years watching for anomalies in supposedly routine operations. The man in seat 8A was reading financial reports, but his hands shook slightly as he turned each page. The woman in 12C kept checking her watch and glancing toward the cockpit door with the nervous energy of someone expecting bad news. Most telling of all, the flight attendant who had introduced herself as Monica was moving through the cabin with the forced smile of someone performing a role they desperately wished they could abandon. Sarah had requested an aisle seat specifically so she could observe the other passengers, and what she saw confirmed her growing suspicion that this was no ordinary commercial flight. These weren't vacationers heading to Phoenix for golf and sunshine, or business travelers making routine sales calls. These were people who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else in the world, people who kept their briefcases clutched close and their conversations limited to nervous whispers. As the aircraft leveled off at cruising altitude, Sarah pulled out her phone and began scrolling through the photos she'd taken of David's flight manual over the past 8 months. She'd memorized every notation, every calculation, every seemingly random string of numbers and letters that her husband had recorded in the weeks before his death. At first, she'd thought they were simply the obsessive safety checks that all good pilots performed, but now she was beginning to see patterns that suggested something far more sinister. The mathematical sequences weren't random at all. They were access codes, frequency modulations for aircraft communication systems, override protocols for autopilot functions, and most chilling of all, what appeared to be remote activation sequences for systems that weren't supposed to exist on commercial aircraft. "Excuse me, ma'am," Monica's voice interrupted Sarah's concentration. "Would you like something to drink?" Sarah looked up to find the flight attendant standing beside her seat, holding a tray of beverages with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly. Monica was perhaps 40 years old, with the kind of professional appearance that spoke of decades in the service industry, but her eyes held a haunted quality that reminded Sarah of her own reflection in recent months. "Coffee, please," Sarah said, then lowered her voice to barely above a whisper. "Are you all right? You seem nervous." Monica's professional smile flickered for just a moment, and Sarah saw something she recognized, the look of someone who knew a terrible secret and couldn't decide whether sharing it would save lives or destroy them. "Just turbulence," Monica said, but her voice carried the same tremor that Sarah had noticed in Jessica Torres back at the gate. "Nothing to worry about." But as Monica moved away, she dropped a small piece of paper beside Sarah's seat, so smoothly that it appeared accidental to anyone who might be watching. Sarah waited until the flight attendant had moved to the next row before picking up the paper and unfolding it carefully. Written in hurried handwriting were 5 words that made Sarah's blood freeze. "They know you're on board." Sarah's training kicked in immediately, the same calm focus that had allowed her to guide aircraft safely through thousands of hours of air traffic control operations. She didn't look around frantically or show any outward sign of alarm. Instead, she simply folded the note and slipped it into her pocket while continuing to scroll through the photos on her phone as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The paranoid theories that her sister Lisa had dismissed as grief-induced delusions were suddenly terrifyingly real. Someone on this aircraft knew who she was and why she was traveling to Phoenix. More importantly, they had felt the need to warn her about it, which meant that her presence on Flight 447 was significant enough to be dangerous. Sarah began to pay closer attention to the conversations around her, using the audio skills she'd developed from years of monitoring multiple radio frequencies simultaneously. Most of the passengers were maintaining careful silence, but she could pick up fragments of whispered discussions that painted a disturbing picture. Testimony is scheduled for 9 a.m. If the evidence comes out, no choice now, it's too late to... 20 minutes into the flight, a man in his 50s rose from his seat in first class and began walking toward the back of the aircraft. Sarah recognized him immediately from the legal documents. Marcus Whitfield, Senior Vice President of Operations for Meridian Airlines, the man whose signature appeared on dozens of cost-cutting memos that prioritized profits over safety protocols. Whitfield was tall and lean, with the kind of expensive haircut and tailored clothing that announced his status before he spoke a word. But as he approached Sarah's row, she could see the stress lines around his eyes, the slight tremor in his hands that suggested someone fighting to maintain control over a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond his ability to manage. He stopped beside her seat and looked down at her with the expression of a man studying an interesting but potentially dangerous specimen. "Mrs. Chen," he said, his voice carrying the smooth confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way through charm and authority. "I don't believe we've been formally introduced. Marcus Whitfield, Meridian Airlines." Sarah looked up at him without moving to shake his offered hand. "I know who you are, Mr. Whitfield. Your name is all over my husband's case file." Whitfield's smile tightened almost imperceptibly, but he maintained his composure with the skill of someone who had spent years navigating corporate politics. "Yes, well, that's actually what I wanted to discuss with you. Perhaps we could have a private conversation. There's an empty row in the back where we could talk more comfortably." "I'm comfortable here," Sarah said evenly. "If you have something to say about my husband's death, you can say it right here." Around them, other passengers were beginning to take notice of the conversation. Sarah could feel the tension in the cabin ratcheting up as people who had been trying to remain invisible suddenly found themselves witnessing a confrontation that none of them wanted to be part of. Whitfield glanced around nervously, then leaned closer to Sarah's seat. "Mrs. Chen, I think there may be some misunderstandings about the circumstances of your husband's accident. Perhaps we could discuss a generous settlement arrangement, one that would allow you to move forward with your life without the stress of prolonged litigation." The offer was delivered with the kind of practiced sympathy that Sarah had heard from insurance adjusters and corporate lawyers for 8 months, but now she understood it for what it really was. Not generosity, but desperation. They weren't offering her money out of guilt or genuine concern for her welfare. They were trying to buy her silence because they were terrified of what she might have discovered. "My husband wasn't killed in an accident," Sarah said, her voice loud enough for several nearby passengers to hear clearly. "He was murdered, and I have the evidence to prove it." The effect of her words was immediate and dramatic. Conversations throughout the cabin stopped abruptly, and Sarah could feel dozens of eyes turning toward their confrontation. But more importantly, she saw the way several passengers in business class exchanged quick, meaningful glances. The kind of looks that passed between conspirators when their carefully laid plans suddenly faced an unexpected threat. Whitfield's composure finally cracked, and for a moment Sarah saw the real man beneath the corporate facade. Someone who was scared, possibly desperate, and definitely dangerous when cornered. "Mrs. Chen," he said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper, "I think you're making a very serious mistake, the kind of mistake that could have consequences for everyone on this aircraft." The threat was delivered with such casual menace that Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. But instead of intimidating her, Whitfield's words confirmed what she had already begun to suspect. That Flight 447 was never intended to reach Phoenix safely, and that everyone on board was now part of a conspiracy that had already claimed her husband's life. She stood up slowly, using her full height to look Whitfield directly in the eyes. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Whitfield? Because if you are, I should point out that we're surrounded by witnesses, and this conversation is being recorded." Sarah held up her phone, which had indeed been recording since the moment Whitfield approached her seat. The sight of the device seemed to hit him like a physical blow, and she watched his face cycle through a range of emotions: surprise, fear, and finally a cold calculation that made her skin crawl. "You have no idea what you're involved in," Whitfield said quietly. "No idea what your husband stumbled into, or what kind of forces you're playing with. This isn't some simple case of corporate negligence that can be solved with a lawsuit and a settlement check. This is about national security, about threats to aviation safety that go far beyond anything you could possibly understand." "Then explain it to me," Sarah said. "Tell me why my husband had to die. Tell me why these passengers look like they're attending their own funeral. Tell me why that flight attendant is terrified, and why Jessica Torres tried to keep me off this plane." For a moment, Whitfield seemed to consider her challenge. Sarah could see him weighing his options, calculating the risks and benefits of honesty versus continued deception. Around them, the cabin had gone completely silent, except for the steady hum of the aircraft's engines and the whispered breathing of passengers who suddenly understood that they were witnessing something far more significant than a simple dispute over airline compensation. Finally, Whitfield made his choice. "Your husband discovered something he shouldn't have," he said, his voice barely audible. "A system that was designed to protect American aviation from terrorist attacks, but could also be used to address other threats to airline operations. David became a liability when he started asking questions about Flight 1247's crash sequence. Questions that could have compromised national security." "You're talking about a remote override system," Sarah said, putting pieces together that she'd been collecting for months. "A way to take control of aircraft from the ground. David found out about it, and you killed him to keep him quiet." Whitfield's silence was confirmation enough, but as Sarah looked around the cabin, she began to understand the full scope of what was happening. The other passengers weren't random travelers. They were all connected to David's investigation. The federal aviation inspectors who had agreed to testify about safety violations, the mechanics who had refused to sign non-disclosure agreements, the journalists who had been investigating suspicious patterns in airline accidents. Flight 447 wasn't a commercial flight at all. It was an execution chamber designed to eliminate everyone who posed a threat to Meridian Airlines' use of technology that should never have existed in the first place. And now Sarah understood why Jessica Torres had tried so desperately to keep her off the aircraft, because this flight was never intended to land safely in Phoenix. It was going to become another tragic accident, another mechanical failure that would be investigated by the same corrupt officials who had covered up David's murder. The only question now was whether she could do anything to stop it. If you're finding this story as gripping as I am while writing it, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible true stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Now back to Sarah's fight for the truth. The silence that followed Whitfield's admission stretched like a taut wire through the cabin of Flight 447. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears, could feel the weight of a dozen sets of eyes watching this confrontation unfold, could taste the metallic fear that had begun to permeate the recycled air. But beneath the shock of finally hearing confirmation of what she had suspected for 8 months, her mind was already racing through the implications of what Whitfield had just revealed: a remote override system. Technology that could commandeer aircraft from the ground, turning passenger jets into weapons, or in this case, into untraceable murder weapons disguised as accidents. The very system that David had discovered, that had cost him his life, was now being used to eliminate everyone who knew about its existence. Sarah slowly lowered herself back into her seat, never breaking eye contact with Whitfield. Around them, she could sense other passengers beginning to understand that they had just witnessed something far more significant than a routine airline customer service dispute. The businessman in 8A had abandoned all pretense of reading his financial reports and was staring openly at their conversation. The woman in 12C had her phone out, though Sarah noticed her hands were shaking too badly to actually use it. "How many planes?" Sarah asked quietly, her voice carrying just far enough for the nearest passengers to hear. "How many accidents have you caused with this system?" Whitfield glanced around the cabin nervously, clearly realizing that this conversation had already gone far beyond what he had intended. But there was something in his expression that suggested a man who had carried the weight of terrible secrets for too long, someone who might actually find relief in finally speaking the truth, even if it destroyed him. "Fewer than you might think," he said, settling uninvited into the empty middle seat beside Sarah. The technology was originally developed by a defense contractor for the Department of Homeland Security. The idea was to create a fail-safe against terrorist hijackings, a way to override pilot control if aircraft were being used as weapons. Sarah felt her stomach clench as the pieces clicked into place. But someone realized it could be used for other purposes. "The aviation industry is worth over $700 billion annually," Whitfield continued, his voice taking on the rehearsed cadence of someone who had rationalized these decisions many times before. "When that much money is at stake, certain adjustments become necessary to maintain stability. Whistleblowers, investigative journalists, federal inspectors who refuse to be reasonable about regulatory compliance, they all represent threats to the economic health of American aviation." "You're talking about murder," Sarah said, loud enough now that her words carried clearly through the first 10 rows of the aircraft. "You're talking about killing American citizens to protect corporate profits." The effect of her words was immediate and electric. Throughout the cabin, passengers who had been trying to maintain the pretense of normal air travel suddenly abandoned all attempts at concealment. Cell phones appeared as people tried desperately to contact loved ones, to send messages, to somehow communicate what they were hearing to the outside world. But as Sarah watched these frantic attempts at communication, she noticed something that sent ice through her veins. None of the phones were getting signal. Despite being at cruising altitude, where aircraft communications should be functioning normally, every device was showing no service, no connection to the outside world. "You're jamming communications," she said, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. Whitfield nodded with something that might have been professional pride. "Standard protocol for these operations. Can't have passengers calling air traffic control or the media while the flight is in progress. Too much risk of interference." Sarah's training as an air traffic controller allowed her to understand immediately what Whitfield was implying. If Flight 447 was operating under communication blackout, then the aircraft was essentially invisible to ground control systems. No radar tracking, no radio contact, no way for anyone on the ground to know what was happening until it was too late. "Where are we really going?" she asked. "Because I'm guessing it's not Phoenix." For the first time since their conversation began, Whitfield looked genuinely uncomfortable. He glanced toward the cockpit door, then back at Sarah, and she could see him wrestling with how much truth he could afford to reveal. "There's a private airstrip in Nevada," he said finally, "former military installation that was decommissioned in the 90s. Very isolated, perfect for training exercises." "Training exercises," Sarah repeated, feeling the words like poison on her tongue. "You mean crashes? You mean making this aircraft disappear along with everyone on it?" Around them, the cabin was erupting into barely controlled panic as other passengers began to understand what they were hearing. The federal aviation inspectors in business class were huddled together, reviewing documents with the frantic energy of people trying to preserve evidence they knew might never see daylight. The two mechanics from Meridian's maintenance division were arguing in whispered tones about whether they could somehow access the aircraft's control systems from the cabin. But it was Monica, the flight attendant, who provided the detail that made everything crystallize into terrifying clarity. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced over the cabin speaker system, her voice cracking with emotion, "I need to inform you that this aircraft has been equipped with a remote piloting system that has been activated by ground control. The pilots are no longer in command of this flight." The announcement hit the cabin like an explosion. Passengers who had been maintaining careful composure suddenly broke into open terror, demanding answers, grabbing for oxygen masks that hadn't deployed, trying desperately to contact the outside world on phones that remained stubbornly silent. But Sarah found herself focusing on something else entirely. Monica's announcement had included a crucial piece of information that Whitfield hadn't mentioned. The pilots themselves weren't part of the conspiracy. Captain Hayes and First Officer Rodriguez were victims just like the passengers, helpless to control their own aircraft as it flew toward a destination none of them would survive. She stood up again, this time addressing not Whitfield, but the entire cabin. "Listen to me," she called out, her voice cutting through the rising panic with the authority that came from years of managing crisis situations in air traffic control. "My name is Sarah Chen. My husband was Captain David Thompson, and he was murdered 8 months ago because he discovered what's happening to us right now." The effect of her words was immediate. The chaos in the cabin didn't stop, but it focused, as passengers who had been panicking individually suddenly realized they were part of something larger and more organized than random terrorism. "The people behind this conspiracy are counting on us to panic," Sarah continued, pulling David's flight manual from her bag and holding it up for everyone to see. "They're counting on us to be helpless victims. But my husband left me something before he died, something that might be able to save all of us." She opened the manual to a page covered with David's careful notations, numbers and letters that she had memorized but never fully understood until this moment. Now, with Whitfield's revelations providing context, she could see what her husband had really discovered. "These aren't just safety calculations," she announced, her voice growing stronger as the pieces fell into place. "These are override codes, access protocols for the same system that's controlling our aircraft. David figured out how to break into it." Whitfield lunged toward her, desperation finally overcoming his corporate composure. "You don't understand what you're doing," he hissed, grabbing for the flight manual. "That system isn't just controlling this aircraft. It's integrated into the entire American aviation network. If you interfere with it, you could bring down passenger jets across the country." But Sarah pulled the manual away from his reaching hands, and as she did, something fell from between its pages, something she had never noticed before despite months of studying every detail of David's work. A small envelope, yellowed with age, with her name written on the outside in her husband's careful handwriting. With trembling fingers, she opened the envelope and pulled out a single sheet of paper, David's final letter to her, written in the days before his death, when he must have known that his investigation had put him in mortal danger. "My dearest Sarah," she read aloud, her voice carrying to every corner of the now silent cabin. "If you are reading this, then my worst fears have come true, and the people I trusted to keep our skies safe have instead turned them into instruments of murder. But you should know that I did not die in vain, and that the work we shared in making aviation safe for everyone was not meaningless." She paused, struggling to control her voice as the full weight of David's sacrifice hit her for the first time. Around her, passengers leaned forward, hanging on every word of a dead man's testimony against the conspiracy that had claimed his life. "The codes in this manual aren't just evidence of what Meridian Airlines has done," she continued reading. "They're a roadmap to shutting down the entire remote override network permanently, but using them requires someone who understands both air traffic control protocols and aircraft navigation systems. Someone exactly like you, my love." Sarah looked up from the letter to find every passenger on the aircraft staring at her with expressions that ranged from desperate hope to absolute terror. She held in her hands not just evidence of a massive conspiracy, but potentially the key to stopping it, assuming she could figure out how to use David's codes before Flight 447 reached its deadly destination. The aircraft banked slightly to the left, and through the small windows, Sarah could see the lights of civilization falling away below them as they flew toward the empty darkness of the Nevada desert. Time was running out, and the most important test of her life was about to begin. The letter trembled in Sarah's hands as she continued reading David's final words, his voice seeming to echo through the cabin, despite the impossibility of such a thing. Around her, the passengers of Flight 447 had fallen into a silence so complete that she could hear the subtle changes in engine pitch that indicated their aircraft was descending, moving inexorably toward whatever fate awaited them in the Nevada wilderness. The override system operates on a cascading frequency protocol, Sarah read, her training allowing her to understand the technical language that would have been meaningless to most people. Each aircraft in the network receives commands through a primary control signal, but there's a master override that can be activated from any aircraft equipped with the proper access codes. Sarah, if something happens to me, you'll need to find someone who understands the system from the inside, someone who helped build it but came to regret their part in its creation. She looked up from the letter, scanning the faces of her fellow passengers with new understanding. David hadn't just left her evidence of the conspiracy. He'd given her a roadmap to finding allies within the system itself. Somewhere on this aircraft was someone who knew how the override technology worked, someone who might have the expertise needed to turn David's codes into actual salvation. Her eyes settled on a man in his early 60s, sitting 3 rows ahead, someone she'd noticed earlier, but dismissed as just another business traveler. But now, looking at him more carefully, she recognized something in his posture, in the way he held himself with the careful dignity of someone carrying enormous guilt. His hands showed the calloused evidence of technical work, and his clothes, while professional, had the practical quality of someone who valued function over fashion. "Excuse me," Sarah called out, her voice cutting through the cabin's heavy silence. "Are you Dr. James Morrison?" The man's head snapped up, and Sarah saw in his eyes the same haunted quality she'd been carrying for 8 months. He was older than his file photo had suggested, with grey hair and deep lines around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and moral struggles that had aged him beyond his years. "You know who I am," he said quietly, not really a question. Sarah made her way down the aisle toward him, David's letter and flight manual clutched against her chest. "My husband mentioned you in his notes. You were the lead engineer on the Skynet aviation control system before you resigned from Meridian's contractor division." Morrison's face went pale at the mention of Skynet, the benign-sounding name that masked one of the most dangerous technologies ever deployed in civilian aviation. Around them, other passengers were beginning to understand that they were witnessing something unprecedented. A meeting between the widow of a murdered whistleblower and one of the men who had helped create the weapon used to kill him. "Mrs. Chen," Morrison said, rising from his seat with the careful movements of someone much older than his years. "I tried to warn your husband. When I learned he was investigating Flight 1247, I sent him anonymous messages, tried to steer him away from the truth. I hoped he would drop the investigation before they decided he was too dangerous to live." But he didn't drop it," Sarah said, settling into the empty seat beside Morrison while other passengers craned their necks to hear their conversation. "He kept digging until he found proof of what you'd helped create." Morrison nodded, his hands clasping and unclasping with nervous energy. "The system was supposed to be a safeguard," he said, his voice carrying the weight of profound regret. "After September 11th, the government wanted a way to prevent hijacked aircraft from being used as weapons. The idea was simple. If terrorists took control of a plane, ground controllers could override the pilot controls and land the aircraft safely at a secure location. "But that's not how it's being used," Sarah said. "No," Morrison agreed, his voice barely above a whisper. "The technology works too well. Once we'd proven that any aircraft could be controlled remotely, certain people began to see other applications. Corporate executives who needed problematic employees to disappear. government officials who wanted to eliminate whistleblowers without the messy politics of prosecution, even foreign governments who were willing to pay for untraceable assassinations. Sarah felt sick as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. This wasn't just about Meridian Airlines protecting their profits. It was about a technology that had turned American commercial aviation into a weapon for hire, available to anyone with enough money and influence to purchase a clean kill. "How many?" she asked. "How many people have died because of what you built?" Morrison closed his eyes, and Sarah could see him calculating numbers he'd obviously tabulated many times before. In the past 3 years, 47 confirmed cases. Aircraft that experienced mechanical failures or pilot error accidents that were actually remote terminations. Passengers, crew and targets, over 1,800 people total. The number hit the cabin like a physical blow. 1,800 innocent lives lost to protect the secrets and profits of people who viewed human beings as acceptable collateral damage. Sarah could hear several passengers quietly weeping, while others muttered prayers in languages she didn't recognize. But Morrison wasn't finished with his confession. "Your husband's flight was supposed to be a simple termination," he continued, his voice growing stronger as he unburdened himself of secrets he'd carried for too long. David had gotten too close to the truth, and Meridian's executives decided he needed to be eliminated. But David was smarter than they realized. He'd figured out how to trace the override signals back to their source. His investigation wasn't just about proving that Flight 1247 was murdered. He was mapping the entire network. Sarah opened David's flight manual to the pages covered with his mathematical notations, understanding finally dawning on her. "These aren't just access codes," she said. "They're a complete schematic of the system architecture. Every aircraft equipped with Skynet technology," Morrison confirmed. "Every ground control station. Every satellite relay that carries the override signals." David had figured out how to identify and disable the entire network. Around them, the other passengers were beginning to understand what they were hearing. The federal aviation inspectors had pulled out their own files and were cross-referencing David's notations with their own investigation records. The mechanics were examining technical drawings that suddenly made sense in light of Morrison's revelations. Even Marcus Whitfield was staring at the flight manual with an expression of dawning horror as he realized how thoroughly his conspiracy had been penetrated. "Can we use it?" Sarah asked urgently. "Can we use David's work to regain control of this aircraft?" Morrison examined the notations carefully, his trained eye picking out details that would have been invisible to anyone without intimate knowledge of the system's design. "In theory, yes," he said slowly. "The override commands operate through the aircraft's communication array. If we could access the cabin's entertainment system, we might be able to piggyback a signal through the satellite uplink." But as he spoke, Morrison's expression was growing increasingly grim. "The problem is that Skynet has fail-safes built into it. If the system detects unauthorized access attempts, it triggers an immediate termination protocol. Instead of flying to Nevada for a staged crash, the aircraft would simply fall from the sky." The cabin erupted into desperate arguments as passengers grappled with an impossible choice: attempt to break into the override system and risk immediate death, or allow the flight to continue to its planned destination, where they would certainly be murdered in a way designed to look like an accident. But Sarah found herself thinking about something else entirely. About Jessica Torres, standing at the gate in Denver, terrified but determined to warn a stranger about the danger she was walking into. About Monica, the flight attendant, risking her own life to pass information to passengers. About David, spending his final weeks mapping a conspiracy that he knew would probably cost him his life. All of them had made the choice to do what was right despite the personal cost. Now it was Sarah's turn to make the same choice. She stood up, David's flight manual in her hands, and addressed the entire cabin. "My husband died because he believed that some things are more important than personal safety," she announced, her voice carrying the strength that came from finally understanding her purpose. He believed that people who get on airplanes should be able to trust that they'll reach their destination alive. He believed that the truth matters more than the convenience of those in power. She looked around the cabin, making eye contact with as many passengers as possible. We can sit here and hope for rescue, or we can use what David gave us to fight back. But if we're going to try to break into this system, we need to do it together. Because if we fail, we all die. And if we succeed, we might be able to save not just ourselves, but every future passenger who would have been murdered by this technology. The vote was wordless, but unanimous. One by one, passengers throughout the cabin nodded their agreement, choosing to risk immediate death for the chance to strike back against the conspiracy that had already claimed so many lives. Morrison opened his laptop and began explaining how they could access the aircraft's communication systems through the entertainment network. The federal inspectors started organizing David's evidence into a comprehensive case file that could be transmitted to authorities on the ground. The mechanics began identifying ways to physically access the aircraft's control systems if the electronic override attempt failed. And Sarah Chen, widow of Captain David Thompson, prepared to use her husband's final gift to expose the truth that had cost him everything. Outside the aircraft windows, the lights of Las Vegas appeared on the horizon, a glittering oasis in the desert darkness. But Sarah knew they would never reach that destination unless they succeeded in doing something that no one had ever attempted before, turning a flying murder weapon back into an instrument of justice. The real battle for Flight 447 was about to begin. The transformation of Flight 447's cabin from a chamber of despair into a coordinated resistance operation happened with the swift efficiency that only mortal peril can inspire. Within minutes of Sarah's call to action, the aircraft had been divided into functional teams, each group working with desperate focus to accomplish tasks that seemed impossible under normal circumstances. Dr. Morrison had commandeered the entertainment system control panel, his fingers flying over the interface as he worked to establish a backdoor connection to the aircraft's primary communication array. The federal aviation inspectors huddled around him, feeding him technical specifications from their files, while simultaneously preparing a comprehensive evidence package that could be transmitted to authorities on the ground if they managed to break through the communication blackout. Sarah found herself at the center of it all, translating David's coded notations into actionable intelligence while coordinating between the different groups. Her years of air traffic control experience had prepared her for exactly this kind of crisis management, where split-second decisions and clear communication meant the difference between life and death for hundreds of people. But it was Marcus Whitfield's transformation that proved most startling. The Meridian Airlines executive who had boarded Flight 447 as one of the conspiracy's key architects was now slumped in his first-class seat, staring at his hands with the expression of a man watching his entire worldview collapse in real time. As the passengers around him worked frantically to expose and destroy the network he'd helped create, Whitfield seemed to age years in the span of minutes. 1,800 people, he kept repeating to himself, just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. 1,800 innocent people. Sarah looked up from David's flight manual to find Whitfield staring directly at her, his carefully constructed corporate facade completely abandoned. For the first time since their confrontation began, she saw him not as a villain, but as a human being grappling with the magnitude of what he'd helped unleash. "Mrs. Chen," he said, his voice hoarse with something that might have been genuine remorse, "I need you to understand. When this started, we told ourselves we were protecting American aviation. The technology was supposed to be used only in extreme circumstances, against genuine threats to national security." Sarah moved closer to his seat, drawn by something in his voice that suggested a man finally ready to tell the complete truth. Around them, Other passengers continued their frantic work, but she could sense them listening to Whitfield's confession with the intensity of people who needed to understand how such a monstrous conspiracy had been allowed to exist. "How did it start?" she asked quietly. "How do you go from preventing terrorism to murdering whistleblowers?" Whitfield laughed bitterly, a sound completely devoid of humor. "The same way every corruption starts," he said. "One small compromise at a time. The first case wasn't even supposed to be a kill, just a warning. There was a journalist investigating safety violations at 3 major airlines. Instead of killing him, we were going to use Skynet to cause a minor malfunction on a flight he was taking. Something scary but non-fatal that would convince him to drop his investigation. But something went wrong," Sarah guessed. "The override signal was stronger than anticipated," Whitfield confirmed. "Instead of a minor hydraulic failure, we got a complete systems cascade. The aircraft went down with everyone on board. 143 people, including the journalist we'd been trying to scare." Sarah felt sick as she imagined the moment when the conspiracy's architects realized they'd accidentally committed mass murder. But instead of confessing and dismantling the system, they'd chosen to cover up their mistake and continue using the technology for increasingly corrupt purposes. "After that," Whitfield continued, "it became easier to rationalize. We'd already killed innocent people, so what difference did a few more make? And the money, God, the money was incredible. Foreign governments paying millions for untraceable assassinations, corporate executives eliminating business rivals, even government agencies cleaning up their own messes." "Like my husband," Sarah said, her voice sharp with controlled anger. Whitfield nodded miserably. "David was supposed to be a simple termination, but when we realized how much he'd discovered, how detailed his investigation had become, we panicked. Instead of just killing him, we should have tried to recruit him, or at least tried to understand how much information he'd already shared with others." "You mean you should have killed me too?" Sarah said bluntly. "Yes," Whitfield admitted, the word coming out like a confession to a priest. "We should have killed you, your sister, anyone David might have told about his investigation. But I convinced the others that a grieving widow with no technical background posed no real threat. I thought we could manage you with legal pressure and financial incentives." Sarah almost laughed at the irony. Whitfield's decision to spare her life out of sexist assumptions about her capabilities had ultimately led to this moment, where she was using her husband's final gift to expose the entire conspiracy. "Mrs. Chen," Whitfield said urgently, leaning forward in his seat. "I know I have no right to ask anything of you, but I need you to understand something. There are people involved in this conspiracy who are much more dangerous than airline executives trying to protect quarterly profits. Military contractors who see Skynet as a prototype for weaponizing civilian aircraft. Intelligence agencies who want to use it for operations that can never be officially acknowledged." "You're saying it's bigger than just Meridian Airlines," Sarah said. "Much bigger," Whitfield confirmed. "If you succeed in exposing this network, you'll be taking on people who have killed to protect smaller secrets. They won't just come after you. They'll go after your family, your friends, anyone who might have information about David's investigation." Around them, Dr. Morrison's work on the communication system was beginning to show results. The entertainment screens throughout the cabin had gone dark, replaced by scrolling lines of code, as he attempted to establish an uplink to ground-based servers. The federal inspectors were uploading David's evidence files, preparing to transmit everything to multiple agencies simultaneously if they could break through the communication blackout. But Sarah found herself thinking about Whitfield's warning, about the broader implications of what they were attempting. Exposing Meridian Airlines' use of the Skynet technology would indeed save the passengers on Flight 447, but it would also trigger a much larger conflict with adversaries who had far more resources and fewer scruples than a corrupt airline executive. She thought about her parents, about the jade bracelet on her wrist, about the lessons Wei and Lin had taught her about facing hardship together. They had come to America with nothing, had built a life through determination and mutual support, had raised a daughter who believed that some principles were worth any sacrifice. "Mr. Whitfield," she said finally, "8 months ago, you and your conspirators made a choice to value your convenience over my husband's life. You decided that protecting your secrets was more important than protecting innocent people. Now you're asking me to make the same choice, to value my safety over the truth." Whitfield's face crumpled as he realized what her words meant. "You're going to do it anyway," he said, "even knowing what it will cost you." "David made this choice 8 months ago," Sarah replied. "He knew that investigating Flight 1247 would probably get him killed, but he did it anyway because he believed that airline passengers deserved to be safe. I'm not going to dishonor his sacrifice by choosing cowardice now." She turned away from Whitfield and raised her voice to address the entire cabin. "Dr. Morrison, what's our status?" Morrison looked up from his laptop, his face flushed with excitement. "I've got a connection," he announced. "Weak signal, but stable. We can transmit data to the FBI, the FAA, and several news organizations simultaneously." "Then let's do it," Sarah said. "Upload everything. David's evidence, the passenger manifest, Dr. Who, Morrison's testimony, everything we have about the Skynet network." As Morrison began the upload process, Sarah noticed that Marcus Whitfield had pulled out his own phone and was composing what appeared to be a lengthy text message. For a moment, she wondered if he was trying to warn his co-conspirators, but then she saw the recipients list. His wife, his children, his brother who worked as a pilot for a different airline. He was saying goodbye, she realized. Or perhaps he was trying to warn them about the storm that was about to break when Flight 447's evidence reached the outside world. "Upload complete," Morrison announced. "The files are being distributed to 14 different agencies and news organizations. Even if they try to suppress it, the information is too widely spread to contain." Throughout the cabin, passengers began to cheer, the sound echoing strangely in the confined space as people who had been facing certain death suddenly dared to hope for survival. But Sarah found herself focused on something else entirely, the subtle change in the aircraft's engine sound that indicated they were beginning to descend. She moved to one of the small windows and looked out into the desert darkness below. In the distance, she could see a faint glow that might have been runway lights, the private airfield in Nevada, where Flight 447 was supposed to crash with all hands lost. They had succeeded in exposing the conspiracy, but they still faced the immediate problem of preventing their own deaths. The Skynet override system was still in control of their aircraft, and Dr. Morrison had warned that any attempt to break that control could trigger an immediate termination protocol. "We're not finished yet," Sarah called out to the celebrating passengers. "We've exposed the truth, but we still need to survive long enough to testify about what we've learned." She turned to Morrison, who was studying the aircraft's communication systems with the intensity of a man trying to solve an impossible puzzle. "Doctor, can we regain control of the aircraft?" Morrison's expression was grim as he explained their options. "David's codes include what appears to be a master override sequence," he said. "In theory, we could use it to shut down the Skynet connection entirely. But if we try and fail, if the system detects unauthorized access, we fall from the sky." Sarah finished for him. 37,000 feet, Morrison confirmed. "No survivors." Sarah looked around the cabin at the faces of people who had already risked everything to expose the truth about Flight 447. Federal inspectors who had dedicated their careers to aviation safety. Mechanics who had refused to sign non-disclosure agreements despite losing their jobs. A flight attendant who had risked her life to warn passengers about the danger they faced. These people deserved better than to die anonymously in the Nevada desert, their deaths attributed to mechanical failure by the same corrupt officials who had covered up so many murders before theirs. "Show me the override sequence," Sarah said. As Morrison pulled up David's final codes on his laptop screen, Sarah pressed her fingers against the jade bracelet on her wrist and whispered a prayer to ancestors who had faced impossible choices of their own. The battle for Flight 447 was about to reach its climax. The master override sequence filled Dr. Morrison's laptop screen like a digital prayer, 37 lines of code that represented David Thompson's final gift to a wife he would never see again. Sarah stared at the scrolling characters, each symbol carrying the weight of 8 months of grief, investigation, and desperate hope for justice. Around her, the passengers of Flight 447 had fallen into the kind of silence that precedes either salvation or catastrophe. "This is it," Morrison whispered, his finger hovering over the execute key. "Once I input this sequence, the Skynet system will either release control of our aircraft, or it will interpret our access attempt as a hostile intrusion and trigger immediate termination." Through the cabin windows, the lights of the Nevada airfield were growing brighter, no longer a distant glow, but distinct runway markers that indicated they had perhaps 10 minutes before reaching their intended crash site. Sarah could feel the aircraft's descent angle steepening, the engines throttling back as the automated systems prepared to end the flight, exactly as planned by people who viewed mass murder as an acceptable business expense. She thought about David, alone in his cockpit 8 months ago, realizing in his final moments that he had discovered something so terrible that powerful people were willing to kill him to keep it secret. She thought about her parents, building a life from nothing through determination and mutual support, teaching their daughter that some principles were worth any sacrifice. She thought about Jessica Torres at the gate in Denver, terrified but determined to warn a stranger about walking into mortal danger. All of them had chosen courage over safety when the moment of decision arrived. "Execute the sequence," Sarah said. Morrison's finger descended toward the key, but at the last second, Marcus Whitfield's voice cut through the cabin's tense silence. "Wait!" the Meridian executive called out, rising from his first-class seat with the unsteady movements of a man carrying an enormous burden. "There's something else you need to know before you try this." Sarah turned to face him, expecting another attempt at manipulation or delay, but what she saw in Whitfield's expression was something entirely different. He looked like a man who had finally decided to stop running from the consequences of his choices. "The termination protocol isn't just about this aircraft," Whitfield said, his voice carrying to every corner of the now silent cabin. "If the system detects unauthorized access from Flight 447, it will interpret that as evidence of a broader security breach. The automatic response is to activate emergency protocols for every aircraft currently equipped with Skynet technology." "Doctor." Morrison's face went pale as the implications hit him. "How many aircraft?" he asked quietly. "Currently in the air? 43 commercial flights," Whitfield replied, "plus 6 military transports and 14 private jets belonging to government officials and corporate executives. If we trigger the emergency protocol, all of them will be terminated simultaneously." The number hit the cabin like a physical blow. Sarah felt her knees go weak as she calculated the math. 63 aircraft, averaging perhaps 200 passengers each, meant that their attempt to save themselves could result in the deaths of more than 12,000 innocent people. "You're lying!" one of the federal inspectors called out angrily. "You're trying to stop us from exposing this conspiracy." But Morrison was shaking his head, his technical expertise allowing him to see the horrible logic of Whitfield's revelation. "He's not lying," the engineer said quietly. "A system designed to prevent terrorist hijackings would absolutely have fail-safes to prevent unauthorized access. If someone tried to hack into it, the automatic response would be to shut down the entire network permanently." Sarah stared at David's override sequence, the code that represented both their salvation and the potential murder of thousands of innocent people. Her husband had been brilliant, but even he couldn't have anticipated that his final gift would come with such a terrible price. Around her, the passengers of Flight 447 began to grapple with an impossible moral equation: save themselves and condemn thousands of others to death, or accept their own deaths to prevent an even greater tragedy. But as Sarah studied the code more carefully, she began to notice something that Morrison and Whitfield had missed in their focus on the termination protocols. Hidden within David's notations were additional symbols, mathematical sequences that looked familiar from her air traffic control training. "Dr. Morrison," she said urgently, "look at lines 23 through 29. Those aren't override commands, they're sequencing delays." Morrison examined the code more carefully, his expression shifting from despair to cautious hope. "You're right," he said slowly. "Your husband built in a time delay function. If we execute the override, it won't trigger the emergency protocol immediately. We'll have a 30-minute window before the system interprets our access as unauthorized." 30 minutes to do what? Sarah asked. "To send shutdown commands to every other aircraft in the network," Morrison explained, his fingers already flying over the keyboard as he modified the execution sequence. "If we can transmit David's override codes to all 63 flights simultaneously, we can shut down the entire Skynet network without triggering the termination protocols." The cabin erupted into desperate activity as passengers who thought they faced only a choice between their own lives and those of strangers suddenly realized they might be able to save everyone. The federal inspectors began pulling up flight tracking databases, identifying every aircraft currently equipped with Skynet technology. The mechanics started calculating transmission requirements and power consumption. Even Marcus Whitfield was contributing, providing access codes and technical specifications that only someone inside the conspiracy would know. "We'll need more processing power," Morrison announced. "The aircraft's communication system can handle maybe a dozen simultaneous transmissions, but we need to reach 63 flights scattered across the continent." Sarah thought about the problem, her mind racing through options with the systematic approach that had made her one of the youngest senior controllers at Denver International. They needed a way to amplify their signal, to reach aircraft that were hundreds or thousands of miles away, to coordinate a simultaneous shutdown that would prevent any single aircraft from triggering the emergency protocol. Then she remembered something from David's final letter, a detail that hadn't seemed important until now. "The satellite network," she said suddenly. "David wrote that the override system uses satellite relays to carry commands. If we can access the primary satellite hub, we can use their own infrastructure to distribute the shutdown codes." Morrison's eyes widened as he understood what she was suggesting. "Hijack the Skynet satellite network and turn it against itself," he said. "Use their own system to distribute the shutdown commands faster than their emergency protocols can respond." "Can we do it?" Sarah asked. Morrison studied David's code for a long moment, cross-referencing it with technical specifications that Whitfield was providing from his corporate files. "Maybe," he said finally, "but we'll need to execute everything perfectly. One mistake, one transmission delay, and we'll trigger the very catastrophe we're trying to prevent." Through the cabin windows, the Nevada airfield was now clearly visible, its runway lights forming a precise grid in the desert darkness. Sarah could feel Flight 447 continuing its descent, the automated systems bringing them inexorably closer to their planned destruction. They had perhaps 5 minutes before the aircraft reached the point where even manual override would be impossible. She looked around the cabin, at the faces of people who had already risked everything to expose the truth about the Skynet conspiracy. Federal inspectors who had dedicated their careers to protecting aviation safety. Mechanics who had lost their jobs rather than sign agreements that would silence them about safety violations. A flight attendant who had warned passengers despite knowing it could cost her life. These were people who understood that some responsibilities transcended personal safety. "Do it," Sarah said. "Execute the full shutdown sequence." Morrison's fingers moved over the keyboard with practiced precision, inputting commands that would either save 63 aircraft full of innocent people or condemn them all to death. The satellite uplink indicators began flashing as the aircraft's communication system connected to relay stations scattered across the continent. On the screen, A map appeared showing the location of every aircraft equipped with Skynet technology. Sarah watched as transmission indicators began appearing next to each icon, David's override codes spreading through the network like a beneficial virus designed to restore human control to aircraft that had been turned into remote-controlled weapons. Transmission progress 60%, Morrison announced. All aircraft responding normally. No emergency protocols triggered yet. But as they watched the map, Sarah noticed something that made her heart race. Several of the aircraft icons were blinking red, indicating flights that weren't responding to the shutdown commands. Flights where the Skynet system was fighting back against David's override codes. Transmission progress 80%, Morrison called out, but we're losing some of them. The system is adapting, learning to recognize and block the shutdown commands. Sarah felt time running out like sand through her fingers. Outside the windows, the Nevada airfield was rushing toward them with terrifying speed. The aircraft's automated systems were already beginning the final approach sequence that would end with Flight 447 scattered across the desert as burning wreckage. Transmission progress 95%, Morrison announced. 5 aircraft still showing resistance. Make that 3. 2. Boom! The final 2 aircraft icons pulsed red on the screen, their Skynet systems apparently immune to David's override codes. Sarah realized with sick certainty that these must be the newest versions of the technology, equipped with enhanced security protocols that could adapt to unauthorized access attempts in real time. "We can't reach them," Morrison said, his voice tight with frustration. 2 aircraft, maybe 400 innocent passengers, and we can't break through their defenses. Sarah stared at the blinking icons, knowing that their failure to reach those final 2 aircraft would trigger the emergency protocols for the entire network. David's sacrifice, the evidence they had transmitted, the exposure of the conspiracy, all of it would be meaningless if they couldn't complete the shutdown sequence. Then Marcus Whitfield stepped forward, holding a tablet that displayed what appeared to be executive access codes for the Skynet system. "I can reach those final 2 aircraft," he said quietly, "but I'll have to identify myself as a Meridian executive authorizing emergency shutdown. The moment I do that, everyone involved in this conspiracy will know that I've betrayed them." Sarah looked into Whitfield's eyes and saw a man who had finally chosen redemption over self-preservation. "Do it," she said. Whitfield entered his authorization codes, and the final 2 aircraft icons turned green as their Skynet systems accepted shutdown commands from someone they recognized as friendly. "Network shutdown complete," Morrison announced as cheers erupted throughout the cabin. "All 63 aircraft are back under pilot control." But even as the passengers celebrated, Sarah could feel Flight 447 continuing its descent toward the Nevada airfield. They had saved thousands of innocent lives, but they still faced the immediate problem of preventing their own aircraft from crashing. "Can we regain control of our flight?" she asked Morrison urgently. The engineer examined his instruments, then looked up with an expression of pure relief. "Shutdown successful," he announced. "Flight 447 is back under pilot control." "Nutter." Through the cabin speaker system, Captain Hayes's voice crackled with emotion as he addressed his passengers for the first time since takeoff. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. I don't know what you did back there, but whatever it was, thank you. We're diverting to McCarran International Airport in Las Vegas, where federal agents are waiting to take your statements. And Mrs. Chen, if you're listening, your husband would be very proud." As Flight 447 banked away from the Nevada airfield and toward the glittering lights of Las Vegas, Sarah pressed her fingers against the jade bracelet on her wrist and whispered a prayer of gratitude to ancestors who had taught her that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to do what was right despite the cost. The conspiracy that had murdered David Thompson was finally exposed, and the sky was safe once again for innocent people who simply wanted to reach their destinations alive. But Sarah knew that the real work was just beginning. The evidence they had transmitted would trigger investigations that would take years to complete. The people responsible for 1,800 deaths would face justice, but only if witnesses were willing to testify despite the personal risks. As the aircraft descended toward Las Vegas, Sarah began planning for a future where her husband's sacrifice would finally have meaning, where the truth would be more powerful than the convenience of those in power. The flight attendant, Monica, stopped beside her seat as they prepared for landing. "Mrs. Chen," she said quietly, "there's something I need to tell you. My real name is Monica Torres. Jessica is my daughter." Sarah stared at her in amazement as another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. "We've been working together for months," Monica continued. "Jessica at the gate, me in the cabin, trying to document what was happening, trying to find a way to expose the truth. When we learned you were on the passenger manifest, you saw an opportunity," Sarah finished. Monica nodded. "Your husband's investigation gave us the evidence we needed, but we needed someone with the technical knowledge to understand it. Someone with the courage to use it." As Flight 447 touched down safely at McCarran International Airport, Sarah realized that David's death had accomplished something that even he might not have anticipated. It had created a network of resistance, people working in secret to expose a conspiracy that had seemed too powerful to challenge. The jade bracelet caught the airport lights as Sarah gathered her belongings, and for the first time in 8 months, she felt something that had almost been lost in grief and anger. She felt hope. 1 year later, Sarah Chen stood at the podium in the main hearing room of the Hart Senate Office building, looking out at an audience that represented the culmination of everything her husband had died trying to achieve. The Senate Committee on Commerce, Science and Transportation had been holding hearings on aviation safety for 3 weeks, but today's session was different. Today, they would hear the final testimony in what had become known as the Skynet Aviation Conspiracy Hearings. The morning sunlight streaming through the tall windows caught the jade bracelet on Sarah's wrist as she arranged her notes. The same bracelet that had traveled from her great-grandmother's war-torn China to her parents' desperate arrival in America. And finally, to this moment where truth would either triumph over institutional corruption or be buried beneath the weight of political convenience. In the gallery behind her, Sarah could see faces that had become familiar over the past year of investigations, trials, and congressional hearings. Dr. James Morrison, whose expert testimony had helped prosecutors understand the technical aspects of the Skynet system. Monica and Jessica Torres, whose coordination between ground operations and cabin crew had made the Flight 447 exposure possible. Even Marcus Whitfield, whose decision to cooperate with investigators had proven crucial in mapping the full extent of the conspiracy. But it was the empty seats that carried the most weight. 1,800 victims of the Skynet network, passengers and crew members who had died in manufactured accidents designed to look like routine mechanical failures. Their families filled the front rows of the gallery, holding photographs and wearing buttons with their loved ones' names, silent testimony to the human cost of treating aviation safety as a negotiable commodity. Mrs. Chen, Senator Patricia Williams, the committee chairwoman, spoke into her microphone with the gravity that befitted the moment. "You have been our final witness in these proceedings, and I want to thank you for your courage in bringing this conspiracy to light. Before we conclude, would you please share with this committee what you believe the lasting impact of your husband's investigation should be?" Sarah looked down at her notes, but she didn't need them. The words she was about to speak had been forming in her heart for 8 months, refined by grief and anger into a clarity that cut through political rhetoric and corporate doublespeak. "Senator Williams, members of the committee," she began, her voice carrying the strength that came from having faced the worst and survived it. "My husband, David Thompson, was murdered because he believed that people who board aircraft should be able to trust that they will reach their destination safely. He believed that this trust is the foundation of everything that makes aviation possible. The trust between passengers and pilots, between mechanics and inspectors, between airlines and the government agencies that regulate them. She paused, allowing her words to settle over the hearing room with the weight they deserved. The Skynet aviation conspiracy wasn't just about technology that could remotely control aircraft, she continued. It was about the systematic destruction of that trust. It was about turning the safest form of transportation in human history into a weapon for hire, available to anyone willing to pay the price for untraceable murder. In the gallery, she could see family members of Skynet victims nodding in recognition, understanding that their loved ones had died not in accidents, but as casualties of a business model that valued profits over human life. The evidence we have presented to this committee over the past 3 weeks has documented 47 confirmed cases where the Skynet system was used to cause deliberate aircraft accidents. 1,800 people died in those manufactured crashes, including federal aviation inspectors, investigative journalists, whistleblowing employees, and hundreds of innocent passengers whose only crime was being in the wrong place when powerful people needed to eliminate a threat. Sarah's voice grew stronger as she moved into the heart of her testimony, the recommendations that had emerged from a year of investigation and reflection. But the real tragedy isn't just those 1,800 deaths, she said. The real tragedy is that this conspiracy could have continued indefinitely if my husband hadn't been willing to sacrifice his life to expose it. The system was designed to hide its own existence, to make every murder look like an accident, to ensure that no one would ever have reason to investigate because the crashes appeared to have innocent explanations. She looked directly at Senator Williams, then at each committee member in turn, making sure they understood the personal responsibility they bore for ensuring that such a conspiracy could never exist again. This committee has the power to prevent future Skynets, Sarah said, but only if you're willing to acknowledge that technological solutions to security problems must never be implemented without robust oversight, transparency, and accountability. Only if you're willing to admit that giving any organization the power to remotely control aircraft is inherently dangerous, regardless of the supposedly benevolent purposes for which that power was originally intended. The hearing room was completely silent, except for the quiet sounds of reporters typing notes and family members who were quietly weeping as they heard their loved ones' deaths finally acknowledged as murders rather than accidents. My recommendations to this committee are simple, Sarah continued. First, the complete prohibition of any technology that allows remote override of pilot control in commercial aircraft. The risks of such technology being misused will always outweigh any theoretical benefits for counterterrorism. Several committee members were taking careful notes, understanding that Sarah's recommendations would form the basis for the aviation safety legislation that would emerge from these hearings. Second, the establishment of an independent aviation safety oversight board, completely separate from both the Federal Aviation Administration and the Department of Transportation, with the authority to investigate any aircraft accident or incident without interference from airline companies, manufacturers, or government agencies with conflicting interests. This recommendation had been perhaps the most controversial aspect of Sarah's testimony, as it directly challenged the existing regulatory structure that had allowed the Skynet conspiracy to operate for 3 years without detection. Third, mandatory disclosure of any technology installed on commercial aircraft that could potentially affect flight safety or pilot control. Passengers have a right to know if their aircraft is equipped with experimental systems, military-grade technology, or any other equipment that could pose risks not present in standard commercial aviation. Sarah paused again, gathering herself for the most difficult part of her testimony. "Finally," she said, her voice breaking slightly as emotion overtook her careful composure. "I recommend that this committee establish a memorial fund for the victims of the Skynet conspiracy and their families, not as compensation for their losses, which could never be adequately compensated, but as recognition that their deaths served a purpose. They died because someone was willing to murder them to protect a secret, but their deaths ultimately exposed that secret and prevented thousands of future murders. She looked out at the gallery, making eye contact with as many family members as possible. David Thompson, Maria Rodriguez, James Park, Susan Williams, and 1,696 other people died because they either discovered the truth about aviation safety or had the misfortune to be traveling with someone who did. Their deaths were not meaningless accidents, but sacrifices in service of a truth that powerful people would have preferred to keep hidden. Sarah's voice grew stronger as she reached the conclusion of her testimony. If this committee implements the recommendations I have outlined, if you ensure that remote aircraft override technology is permanently prohibited, if you create truly independent oversight of aviation safety, then those 1,800 deaths will have served to protect millions of future passengers who will never know how close they came to being murdered by people who viewed their lives as acceptable collateral damage. She closed her folder of notes and looked directly into the cameras that were broadcasting the hearing live to audiences around the world. My husband David Thompson died because he believed that truth matters more than the convenience of those in power. I'm here today because I believe the same thing, and I will continue to believe it and to fight for it for as long as I draw breath. The hearing room erupted into applause as Sarah stepped back from the microphone, the sound echoing off the marble walls like thunder, but she barely heard it. Her attention focused on something else entirely. The small framed photograph of David that she had placed on the witness table, his smile captured in the moment when he still believed that the system could be reformed from within rather than exposed through sacrifice. Senator Williams called for a recess, and as committee members and staff began filing out of the hearing room, Sarah found herself surrounded by people whose lives had been changed by the events of Flight 447. Dr. Morrison, whose testimony about the Skynet technology had helped prosecutors secure convictions against 17 Meridian Airlines executives and government contractors. Jessica Torres, whose documentation of in-flight evidence had provided crucial corroboration for Sarah's claims. Marcus Whitfield, whose cooperation with investigators had resulted in a reduced sentence of 15 years in federal prison rather than life without parole. But it was a young woman Sarah didn't recognize who approached her as the crowd began to thin. "Mrs. Chen," the woman said, extending her hand with nervous formality. "My name is Lisa Park. My father was James Park, one of the passengers killed in the manufactured crash of Flight 892 2 years ago." Sarah felt her heart clench as she realized she was meeting the daughter of one of the Skynet victims, someone whose father had died in what everyone had believed was a routine mechanical failure until the Flight 447 investigation revealed the truth. "I wanted to thank you," Lisa continued, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "For 2 years, my family has been trying to get answers about why my father's plane crashed. The airline kept telling us it was pilot error, that there was nothing they could have done to prevent it. Now we know the truth, that my father was murdered because he was investigating safety violations at the aircraft maintenance facility where he worked." Sarah took Lisa's hands in her own, feeling the weight of connection that came from shared loss and hard-won justice. "Your father's death wasn't meaningless," Sarah said quietly. "His investigation was part of what led my husband to discover the Skynet system. Without your father's work, David might never have realized that the crashes weren't accidents." Lisa nodded, understanding that her father's death had been part of a larger pattern of resistance that had ultimately brought down the conspiracy that killed him. "What will you do now?" Lisa asked. "Now that the hearings are finished and the legislation is being written," Sarah looked around the hearing room, now nearly empty except for cleaning staff and a few reporters finishing their stories. She thought about the past year of testimony, investigations and trials that had consumed her life since Flight 447. She thought about the future, about the aviation safety legislation that would emerge from these hearings, about the memorial fund that would honor the victims and support their families. But most of all, she thought about David's flight manual, still sitting on her kitchen table where she reviewed it every morning as a reminder of the work that remained to be done. "I'm going back to air traffic control," Sarah said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "The FAA has offered me a position as Senior Safety Coordinator at Denver International. It's a new job, created as part of the reforms that came out of these hearings. I'll be responsible for implementing the new oversight protocols, making sure that what happened to Flight 447 can never happen again." Lisa smiled, understanding that Sarah had chosen to honor her husband's memory not through retirement or withdrawal, but by continuing the work that had cost him his life. As Sarah gathered her belongings and prepared to leave the Hart Senate office building, she felt the jade bracelet's familiar weight against her wrist. Her great-grandmother had carried it through war. Her parents had carried it through immigration and poverty. And now Sarah had carried it through grief and justice into something that felt like hope. Outside the building, the Washington afternoon was crisp and clear, the kind of weather that made aircraft contrails stand out like calligraphy against the blue sky. Sarah looked up at those white lines, knowing that each one represented hundreds of passengers who could now trust that their flight would be controlled by human pilots rather than remote corporate executives with murderous intentions. Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister Lisa in Portland. "Watched the hearing on C-SPAN. Dad would be so proud. Come visit when you're ready. The kids want to hear stories about their aunt who saved the world." Sarah smiled, realizing that for the first time in over a year, the idea of visiting her sister's normal, chaotic household felt appealing rather than overwhelming. She had carried the weight of David's investigation and the Flight 447 conspiracy for so long that she had almost forgotten what ordinary family life felt like. But first, she had one more stop to make. Woodlawn Cemetery in Denver was quiet in the late afternoon, the autumn sun filtering through oak trees that had just begun to turn brilliant shades of red and gold. Sarah made her way along familiar paths to the modest granite headstone that marked David Thompson's final resting place. She knelt beside the grave and placed a copy of the final hearing transcript on the stone, along with a newspaper clipping about the aviation safety legislation that would be signed into law next week. "It's finished," she said quietly, speaking to a husband who couldn't answer, but whose presence she still felt in moments like this. "The Skynet system has been dismantled, the people responsible are in prison, and the laws are being changed to make sure it can't happen again." A commercial aircraft passed overhead, its engines creating the steady rumble that had been the soundtrack to their shared professional life. But now Sarah could hear it without the fear that had haunted her since David's death, without wondering whether the pilots were actually in control or whether some corporate executive was preparing to turn their flight into another convenient accident. "I love you," she whispered to the headstone, "and I promise that the work we started together will continue. Every passenger who boards an aircraft safely, every pilot who maintains control of their flight, every family that arrives home together, they're all part of your legacy now." As Sarah rose to leave, she noticed something that hadn't been there during her previous visits. A small bouquet of flowers, recently placed, with a card signed, "From the crew of Flight 447. Even a year later, the people who had lived through that night continued to honor the investigation that had saved their lives. Walking back to her car, Sarah thought about the future that stretched ahead of her. The new job at Denver International would be challenging, implementing oversight protocols and safety systems that would prevent future conspiracies. There would be resistance from airlines that viewed additional regulation as unnecessary expense, from government agencies that preferred the convenience of unquestioned authority. But Sarah had learned something important during the past year of hearings and investigations. Truth had a power that conspiracy could never match, a weight that could eventually overcome any institutional resistance. It might take time, it might require sacrifice, but it was ultimately unstoppable when people were willing to speak it regardless of the personal cost. As she drove home through the Denver traffic, past the airport, where she would begin her new job next week, Sarah Chen felt something she hadn't experienced since the morning David left for his final flight. She felt ready for whatever came next. The jade bracelet caught the setting sun as she turned into her driveway, carrying the accumulated strength of 4 generations of women who had faced impossible challenges and refused to be broken by them. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new responsibilities, new opportunities to honor the sacrifice that had made justice possible. But tonight, for the first time in over a year, Sarah Chen would sleep peacefully, knowing that the sky was safe and that the truth had finally triumphed over the convenience of those in power. David's flight manual still sat on her kitchen table, but now it was joined by something new. Architectural plans for the David Thompson Memorial Aviation Safety Center, where future air traffic controllers and pilots would learn not just the technical aspects of their professions, but the ethical responsibilities that came with holding other people's lives in their hands. The center would open next fall, funded by settlements from the Skynet conspiracy prosecutions and designed to ensure that no future generation of aviation professionals would be unprepared for the moral challenges they might face. As Sarah turned off the lights and prepared for bed, she could hear aircraft passing overhead, their navigation lights blinking steadily as they followed approaches into Denver International Airport. Each one represented people heading home, families being reunited, travelers reaching their destinations safely because pilots maintained control and systems operated as designed. It was a sound that had once filled her with dread, but now it filled her with something approaching peace. The battle for Flight 447 was over, but the work it had begun would continue for generations. And somewhere in the mountains west of Denver, where the sunset painted the sky in colors that no conspiracy could diminish, the truth continued to matter more than the convenience of those in power.